Welcome to the Native KC. There are many good examples one could point to that justify an extreme appreciation for modern day forms of media. The modern way information is disseminated, the volume of which the stories of our lives are consumed, and the influence of our rapid documentation of the daily coming and going of the African American experience. It's hard to imagine a time when the norm of today substantially morphed how information was gathered, documented, and reported in yesteryear. A pathway for what we know now had to be laid, and this episode is dedicated to a Kansas City woman who arguably laid the foundation for modern-day American journalism and its impact on political, popular, and the revolutionary journalism of today. Miss Lucile H. Bluford. Her story began in Salisbury, North Carolina in 1911. Her father, John Henry Bluford, and mother, Viola Harris Bluford, met in Greensboro, North Carolina, where, after her father John's formal education at both Howard University in D.C. and Cornell University, he taught at the world-renowned North Carolina A&T University. Lucile's mother, Viola, herself a graduate of the famed Oberlin College, one of the only colleges at the time that accepted women, was part of a devout religious household, as her father, Reverend Cicero Harris, led the congregation at the AME Zion Church in Greensboro. Lucile's grandfather, Reverend Harris, would eventually become part of the founding group of ministers for Livingstone College, located just across the street from their family home. When Lucile was just 4 years old, her mother Viola tragically passed away, leaving her younger brothers John Jr. and Guion separated and temporarily raised by close family in the Salisbury, North Carolina area. Now, just a really quick point on Guion Sr., Miss Bluford's nephew. Guion Jr. would become the first African American in history to travel to space. So you can already kind of see where this is headed with this amazing family. John Bluford sought out the opportunity to begin again in the state of Missouri with his new wife, Addie. After a short stay in the St. Louis area, John obtained a chance to teach again in Kansas City. Already an accomplished educator in the collegiate academic systems of the Carolinas, John Bluford humbly accepted a position at the famed all-black Lincoln High School in Kansas City, Missouri. Now, Lucile didn't join the family right away in Kansas City. At this time, she was still in Salisbury and the Greensboro area of North Carolina. And as a 10-year-old, I'm sure grappling with the devastation of losing her mother, yet loved and supported by her grandparents that, like her parents, valued education at the highest degrees. Apprehensively, in 1921, the young Lucile eventually joins her father and siblings in Kansas City, Missouri. Now, keeping in mind that this was the height of the initial Great Migration in the U.S., black families were ditching the South with the mystified hope that the opportunities in cities in the rapidly changing Midwest and Northern states would deliver that ever-elusive American dream. Lucile's father, John, settled in Kansas City with these goals at the forefront of his mind for his family. So it's the 1920s in Kansas City, Missouri. Lucile had slowly found her stride as a student in the Kansas City area, attending Lincoln High School, graduating as valedictorian, leading the student paper during her time at the prominent all-black school. I'm sure with plenty of options, Lucile landed on the nearby University of Kansas as her choice for post-secondary studies in journalism. Balancing academic excellence and a prominent role in the student chapter of the NAACP, involvement that can be attributed to her home life, as her father had been a long-standing member of the organization since its inception. A young Lucile, on the rigidly segregated campus of the University of Kansas, continued to persevere, eventually graduating from the journalism program with honors. It was the systemic bigotry she experienced at KU, layered with an equal amount of gender discrimination, that set in place a lifelong dedication of activism that Lucile would struggle for in the 7 decades that would follow her at the completion of her degree in 1932. Now back in the Kansas City area and working for the Kansas City American as a reporter, the rival paper, the KC Call, led by its founder, Mr. Chester A. Franklin, convinced Lucile to join the weekly paper. It was this decision that set in motion her lifetime contribution of influence, advocacy, and excellence for the Black communities across the country that began in Kansas City. It did not take long for Lucile to find her voice through her journalism at the Kansas City Call. The paper's coverage of African American experiences in Kansas City and beyond as essentially the only outlet and access point to critical issues going on for KC residents. Now in the United States at this time, the NAACP carried out monumental challenges to the American college and university systems. Now these challenges to the national education systems dealt with the discriminatory admittance policies at the dawn of the historic U.S. Supreme Court Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal rhetoric. Now this was all led primarily by the legal counsel of the great Charles Houston, and eventually in the U.S. Supreme Court, Mr. Thurgood Marshall. The state of Missouri became the NAACP's next national target. Now with so much going on across the country with the separate but equal rhetoric with Plessy versus Ferguson, one might wonder how the University of Missouri got on the NAACP's national target list when it came to combating these discriminatory practices. And well, you're at the Native KC channel, so I'm gonna let you know. The University of Missouri School of Law had recently denied a promising and talented St. Louis resident, Lincoln University graduate, and ambitious student, Mr. Lloyd Gaines, admittance into the university solely due to his race. Now, just as a side note here, the story of Mr. Lloyd Gaines is worth exploring on its own. I mean, what we know and what we don't know about his life and his legacy around the University of Missouri, but we'll try to stay on track here with Ms. Bluford. The decision by the University of Missouri to deny Mr. Lloyd Gaines admittance into the University School of Law would kickstart national coverage of what would be multiple suits filed by the NAACP against the University of Missouri in the late 1930s. Now, Ms. Bluford, with close ties to the NAACP at this time, and her great journalism work, had the KC Call right in the middle of the developments of the case, and the pressure on the University of Missouri was mounting. Now, as I mentioned briefly before, in a bizarre and still unknown set of circumstances, Mr. Lloyd Gaines vanished during the preliminary stages of the next steps of his litigation for his case, following the U.S. Supreme Court decision that would force the University of Missouri to accept African American students or adequately provide another state university that offered the equal opportunities. Now, this mysterious disappearance of Lloyd Gaines as the lead plaintiff temporarily let the University of Missouri off the hook. I say temporarily because about a year later, Ms. Bluford, at 28 years old, applied to the University's School of Journalism. In her fearless and timely nature to expose truth and advocate for the disenfranchised, Ms. Lucile Bluford, with the support of the NAACP, SCLC, and other coalition groups fighting for civil rights and against injustice, applied and appealed to the school for enrollment 11 times. Applying 11 times and being denied 11 times, but by this time putting so much pressure on the state and the University of Missouri that it eventually just closes its graduate school program. And the School of Journalism at the all-black Lincoln University in the state was created in 1942. I mean, that's some pressure. Ms. Bluford's efforts, alongside many other courageous civil rights legends, influenced the groundbreaking Brown versus Board of Education U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1951. Originating in nearby Topeka, Kansas, Brown versus the Board of Education arguably changed the course of the public education system in the United States. Ms. Bluford's courageous efforts placed her in the crosshairs of the evil of the systemic inequalities in the United States, but her voice grew louder and her network of support throughout the world grew wider. Her nearly 70-year career going from beat reporter to editor to publisher can be a great point of reference when considering what true advocacy, a lifetime of advocacy, looks like for the disenfranchised. Her influence on gender equality issues and the civil rights movement of Kansas City and across the country helped shape future leaders in all of our public sectors. And her pressure on the systems that perpetuated discrimination informed countless mobilization efforts that moved through the 60s and 70s. In 1989, the University of Missouri, basically 50 years after she applied, was accepted and then later denied admittance once they found out she was a black woman, gave Miss Bluford an honorary doctorate degree. Her name and legacy also continues to live on through the Lucile H. Bluford, Kansas City Public Library branch. Leading up to her passing on June 13th of 2003, Ms. Bluford received numerous legacy awards and distinguished local, regional, and national honors for her courageous spirit and contributions to civil rights and to journalism. Her efforts over her 70 years at the Call paper contributed to its continuation as the voice for the Kansas City African American community. It's easy to identify its values from the great work and efforts of Ms. Bluford's successor, the late Donna Stewart, and men like Eric Wesson, that never splits hairs and always identifies the truth and will not hesitate to challenge the black community and the leadership of Kansas City to be excellent. The spirit of excellence. That's the spirit and energy that clearly flowed through the KC Call and through one of the pillars of the fabric of what makes KC, KC. Round of applause for Miss Lucile H. Bluford. Until next time, if the Lord is willing and the creek don't rise, this is the Native KC.